Hi, here's May and welcome to this animatic tutorial video. I'll go over different steps and show you my process of creating animatics. I'll also include some helpful tips to help you speed up the process and also provide you with some examples from one of my animatics, but I'll also include two different older animatics to show some differences. The program I'll be using for animating is Krita, which is a free drawing or 2D animation software. I'll also show how you can use the program to animate and important tools in it. Later on, for compositing, which you don't have to do depending on how you create your animatics, I use After Effects here, and I also go over some tips for that program related to creating animatics. I will split this whole tutorial up into two parts. The first part will focus on the drawing step and the second part will be about the compositing step. But for now, let's get started with the step-by-step process I usually go for. It all starts with the idea, and this can be in form of some thumbnails or a script. You can do this digitally or on paper. You just have to get your initial idea down and also define it further if needed. Important questions to ask yourself here are: what do you need to show to portray the story you have in mind, and how do you want to portray it? And what is realistic with your own abilities or the time you have? Your imagination can create wonderful scenes and pictures sometimes, but putting them into the actual real world can be very difficult. Now I'll show an example of how I went about doing some thumbnails. So here in my sketchbook I have the initial idea written with words. I then wrote down the lyrics of the song and when I want what to happen, or how I want it to be split up. Here this continues, but this is all just with words. This other book, I have also small thumbnails with place descriptions and so on, but it's very, very messy. You can be as messy as you want. And here I also planned out some of the locations and where I want cameras to be set up. I'll go into this later on because I did make use of a 3D tool where I could place cameras or just take screenshots. Here I also go over this later on. It's for the compositing step. I wrote down some of the transitions I wanted to include, how I want to transition between the clips, but this is all, it depends on how much compositing you want to do, or if you want to use 3D tools, how detailed you want your whole animatic to be. It's really just about getting the idea down into visual form. And as you can see from my sketchbook, the characters were the focus and I only included some background indications. I didn't want to focus on the backgrounds, which is also why I spent most of the time drawing the characters properly, while the backgrounds, especially the ones outside, are very sketchy, but oftentimes it's okay to just indicate things and simplify a lot. I also included one effect animation, which was water. If you want to use it, you can definitely do that as well. Now, after having done the thumbnails, an idea of what scenes you need for your animatic, you can use some tools to help you prepare. And I'll go over some of the ones I used, which help a lot with speeding up the whole process. For backgrounds, if you have a room or a building you want to set up and you also want it to stay consistent, or you just want to make sure the characters are proportional to the environment, you can use Blender, which is a free 3D software, or even if you haven't, you can use Sims 4. And with Blender I have basic knowledge of it since I'm studying animation and game, but if you want to use it to just block out shapes or even import downloaded assets, it's fairly easy to learn. Okay, here we are in Blender, and as you can see, this is how I did a setup of the scene I wanted to do. And for this I downloaded these window assets and also table and chairs. You can do that with multiple sites. I use CG Trader, which is a site where you have to sign up, but then you get some free downloads. But you can also, for example, this is just a plain objects, and here you can add some objects, and also you will have to, if you have some basic keyboard shortcut knowledge, you can easily transform these objects. For example, S is for scaling and G is for moving, but This won't be a Blender tutorial, but I downloaded these assets and imported them. And also, since I did an animatic with Genshin Impact characters, and I found a video on YouTube where someone explained how you can import models from Genshin Impact in Blender, I also included this model, and I also moved it around to when I took some screenshots to just have the character be proportional to the whole space. You could also, of course, like position this character using a rig, but that's too complicated to me and too time consuming. But if you're really good with it, that's also an option you can take. And as I said before, if you have a game like Sims 4 where you can change up camera angles and place objects or so on, you can also create a room and then look for the camera angle you want and take a screenshot there. This is especially useful if you want to use a scene with rooms, but in Sims 4 there are also parks and other areas which you could technically just take screenshots from. However, all of this is only necessary if you want to have a solid environment that stays consistent, and it's especially useful if you have a specific room with different items in it and you just want it to remain consistent. If you don't want to use any 3D tools, but you want your room or whole background to look believable, you can also use perspective grids and draw on them. I prefer doing this for illustrations only though, since it's pretty time consuming in my opinion. And once you have your screenshots or the perspective grids set up, you can then draw your environment from it. But if you only want rough backgrounds or just no background, you can definitely also skip this whole step. I also used a tool to help with posing characters. Since I use Krita, I don't have tools like Clip Studio Paint with 3D models in them, but what I used for a few more complicated poses is a free app on my phone called Magic Poser. There you can place characters and change up the pose or camera angles and lighting. I only did this a few times though, since this takes some time too, and if you're already experienced enough, you'll be able to draw most poses on your own, or you can just look up references to help you. And that's it for the preparation tool tips I have. Now let's move on. From the initial thumbnail step, we move on to the sketching phase, and with this you can do multiple passes or just, for example, one layer with bodies and then one with clothes if you have characters. I would advise to not do too many passes since it takes longer to do it, but if you have cinematography knowledge, make use of it here. I won't go into detail on it in here, but it's always good to have a variety of angles and use the compositions of scenes to tell the story. If you have the screenshots from your environment tools, you can just trace over the elements. Also, if you want to add details or with character poses, if you use models, you can also change up the proportions a little. This is what I did, and then I also just sketched the rest of the character poses in general and the other backgrounds where I didn't use any 3D tools in this example. But now it's probably a good time to introduce the animation features in Krita. Okay, here we are in Krita, and if you just create a new file, you can here pick what dimensions you want it to be in and then just create it. You have your original setup. Now to have access to the whole animation tab, you just go to settings, Dockers, and then animation timeline. This is Krita 5.0, and here you have this Docker called animation timeline. Here, these are the keyframe tools. You can set up new keyframes. Here, if I now draw something here, then I go to the next frame, and now I can introduce another tool, which is here you can find the onion skin tool. And onion skin, it can show you the previous and next frames. And here you can see currently it's set that it shows each frame up to 10, negative 10. You can also just drag this. For example, let's say we just want to see the last two and the next one. And here you can set the colors for previous and next frames. If you have this, what you have to do is go to the layer you're on and then click this icon. Now you can see we have the previous keyframe in red. If I now make a new keyframe here, it still is there since this is at -2, and it shows the second previous keyframe. Here it goes away since now -3 has no color. This way you could it's very useful, this tool, to just see your previous frames and then for characters, for example, make sure they stay consistent. Now here you can play your animation. It currently, the speed is set to 100%, which means in 1 second it will go 24 frames. You can also adjust the playback speed here. For example, 25% is the smallest you can go to, and now it just plays much slower. You can also add other layers and animate on them as well, and this way you can also then turn off one of them and so on, and each layer has its own timeline segment. If you do a right click on the keyframe, you can have access to all of these options. You can copy and paste keyframes and also hold frame, which means that this frame will start here and then it will just continue to show here throughout this space. But if you now would place a new keyframe here, it's gone. If I just turn off the onion skin, see that now here's nothing. But yeah, that's how the basic setup for the animation timeline works. If you don't want to use any video editing software, you should also make sure that your timing is correct, and as far as I know, you can also import audio in Krita if you want to. I like to do some compositing and adjust the timing there, which is why I don't worry about timing in this step. You can also make your life easier by using poses where you duplicate keyframes and just change up the facial expressions or hand gesture, for example. And in the sketching phase, this is especially useful. It's easy to just select an arm and rotate it in one keyframe, and this way you won't have to redraw it only in the final version if you want to. And generally, if possible, you can just reuse some of your sketches if your character makes a similar pose with similar camera angle in one scene to another. And generally, having a character reference sheet or just references for the character is very useful for this step. And keep in mind, if you are using a video editing software later on and you want to, you can also use it to add some movement other than just camera movement. You can mask out an arm and rotate it, for example. It depends on how far you want to go with editing, of course. I'll show some examples of what you can do in the compositing step. For the character drawings, I used mostly key poses and didn't animate straight on, creating realistic animation. But for the effect animation, the water I animated, I used frame by frame animation, which is pretty time consuming, but for a simple effect like water, it's not as complicated as for a character movement. And for this, I used references for water from the Sakuga channel on YouTube and then animated it and exported it as an image sequence. I'll also show how you can do that later on. And sometimes you can find good images to use in your animatic on the internet, but make sure you don't use copyrighted stuff. For example, I added a thought bubble, which I just downloaded as a PNG image. And if you want to make use of some free pictures, you should definitely make sure that it overall fits into the style of your animatic. And now from the sketching phase, we move on to the line art phase, or whatever way you want your animatic to look like in the end. You can of course also use just shapes, no lines, or maybe your animatic already looks finished in the sketching phase. It's up to you how rough you want it to be. And in general, what's important here is layer management. It's probably useful to keep the characters and backgrounds on separate layers most of the time, even in the sketching phase if you want to. That way it's also easier to export the character and background separately and then put them together later on if you're using a compositing software. In general, with the coloring step, you only need to do this if you want to, and it's up to you to decide how far you want to take this step, since it can be very time consuming. Here I am in the animatic file of the animatic I'm mostly showing in this video, and here you can see I have the different layers set up and I just named them lines and color. I have the different layers on different steps also. Here we have, for example, the first sketches, which are very, very rough. Here is a group layer with some of the initial background sketches and characters. But for the background, I also made a separate document, which is also useful if your animatic file gets too big. It can be good to just split it up into multiple files so that your document won't be lagging. Here I have some more sketches from the characters and the background. Yeah, it's very easy to just turn some layers on and off and make use of it. For example, I have 2 color and line layers for the characters, and also this additional layer, which is just for some objects I could export separately. Here, for example, the hand, I wanted to add some movement later on to it, which is why I kept it separate. You can definitely use multiple layers here. Changing up only the eyes or something like that can also work if you just put the eyes on one layer and the rest of the body on another layer, for example. Now we are in the background file, and here you can see I also had a character sketches in here just as a reference to see how big the characters are and make sure that the environment is proportional. And then for the backgrounds I actually used 4 layers with lines, since especially for the background I wanted to create a sense of depth by moving some of the layers on its own. For example, here I could just move this on its own, and then I could move this on its own if I just export it this way and remove some of the line layers. I could export it separately. Also, if I exported it with the transparent background, to really use the whole images separately. Also with the coloring for the background, with some of them I used them again, but I just changed up the scale, and since I knew that I would use them again, I didn't even export this. I would just export the background once, this version, and then later on in the compositing step make it all appear bigger. You can really try to work efficiently. Here you can see the frame by frame water effect animation. If I just play this, you can see for this I also used the onion skin tool I mentioned before. That's it for the background setup. As you could see, I only filled the characters in one color so I could move them in front of the background layers. You could also use multiple flat colors for the hair or the eyes. For the background I also like to go simple using 2 tones or no tone. You can go as far as you want to, and you can also use different layers for different colors. Your file size might get pretty big doing this, but if you use multiple layers you can easily change up the colors afterwards. It's important to just have a plan when going into this step. It's also possible to change up the colors and add some effects during the compositing stage later on. If you want to, you can afterwards also add some shading, which is what I didn't do since it can take long too. However, it can make your animatic look pretty, and there are also methods of adding shadows while compositing. I didn't make use of that though. You can look it up if you want to use it in your own animatic. But if you want to add some shading in the drawing software, I would advise to do it on a separate layer so you can easily change it up. After you're done with your animatic with the 2D drawing step, you have to export it. And now I'll show you how I would go about that in Krita. Here we are back in Krita, and let's say we, for example, want to export this as a video. You will go up to here and to render animation, and to do this you have different options here, but to do this you need the software FFmpeg installed. You can find a tutorial video on that on YouTube or on the Krita site. Here you can have different options as what you want it to render as. I'm just gonna pick the MPEG for video, and let's say we want this to start at frame 68, since that is the frame we are currently at and it's the beginning of the water animation. It probably goes until like frame 80. So let's set the end to 80, and currently it's set to 5 frames per second, which I can work with that. You can also change it up. Here you can specify the location. Let's just name this water animation. I already have the other ones exported here. With this you can press OK. Now it's saving the frames. After it's done, you should have the video file with 5 frames per second. But this is how you export a video. But now let's say you want to export this as a image sequence with the transparency. What you have to do for this is you go to image sequence, and then you can pick the PNG images, and this way you will have the alpha of the whole animation will stay there, and then you specify a location again. Let's say I want it to be in, and I'm gonna create a new folder called V. I'm gonna pick this folder and let's say 68 to 80. You can see that this is how the software will name all the images, and now it will also create this. And let's go to the folder, and here you can see it has exported it all as separate frames, and you can then later on import these frames in your software. And you can also just, if you want to, go to the regular export option and here pick a PNG image. But yeah, that can be very tedious since you often have to do the same step over and over. But if you only have a few frames, you can also work that way. With the naming step, it's definitely good to name your pictures in a way that makes sense. In Krita, it automatically creates the numbers for each frame if you export it as an image sequence. That's it for the exporting step, and with that the first video comes to an end. If you want to use some compositing in the next video, I'll go over some tips and how you can use compositing to make your animatics look very nice and simplify some of the 2D animation steps. We went over the thumbnailing, sketching, using tools to help you with sketching, then also the finishing up the sketching phase. Afterwards we also talked about some coloring and shading if you want to use it, and finally how you can export in Krita. I hope this was helpful to you, and if you're interested in using compositing for your animatic, you can definitely check out the next video that will be about it. If you have any questions, you can leave them in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed this video and have a great day. Goodbye.